Good afternoon, Year 6. We're going to look today within our history session at the life for soldiers within the Western Front, and what it was like for them whilst they were living there during the years of the First World War. As we recall, the First World War happened just over 100 years ago, starting in 1914 and culminating to finishing in 1918. We're going to revisit a little bit to begin with what the war was about. So in terms of the collaborations that were involved in it. So if we look here, there were some alliances, groups of countries which were together. And I'd like you to think about which country was first to declare war, see what you can recall from last week's learning. If you remember, there was an assassination. If you can remember where that assassination was and how that snowball of the assassination led to other problems. So just recalling, we remember that the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, and consequently this set off a collection of instances whereby other countries felt the need to join forces, and eventually the snowball effect culminated with all the countries, or many of the countries around the war, becoming involved in this. Okay. If we look, we can see that there were two main alliances. So we looked at this last week. France, Britain, and Russia were one group of countries, and Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy were the other groups. So see if you can just remember. Just going through this, then the Triple Entente was France, Britain, and Russia, who were, because of their agreements, when one of them was affected by negative attentions from another country, they were duty bound to stop this problem. And the Triple Alliance, although that name changed as World War I went on, for Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, those three countries were the key countries within that Triple Alliance. Okay. Now, the war itself was fought on two fronts. So the extremities of the empires clashed with each other. Okay, so when they came to clash, that's called a front, where the two warring sides face off against each other, the front. The Eastern Front, between Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Romania and Russia, and the Western Front between France, Britain, and Germany. Germany was probably the most powerful country, and they tried to move into the other countries as a means to attack and get on top of the other countries. When the German forces were met by the British and French forces on the Western Front, they dug these deep trenches as a defensive measure. It stopped people getting to them, and it stopped people being able to run through them, and it allowed them to hide so they could not be seen and shot at. The Allied forces did the same, leaving a space between them that became known as no man's land. So there was one set of trenches here, another set of trenches here, and that gap, that space, was called no man's land because nobody would want to go in it. Just have a think why nobody would want to go in it. If there's soldiers with guns here and soldiers with guns here, why would nobody want to go in this space? Now we can see how far these trenches on the Western Front stretch from the sea all the way to France, to the borders with Switzerland. So these are a huge network of trenches which are designed to protect those within them and allow them to move around and pass things around. Now, this no man's land was a dangerous place. Nobody would want to go there because snipers, so soldiers who could shoot at them, or machine guns, kept watch over this space and could kill anybody who went across it. No man's land was often covered with craters, so gaps in the ground that had been left by artillery shells, explosives shot from a long distance, and huge lines of barbed wire. It was a horrible place to be and an awful place to have to go across because you knew you were at great peril, you were at great risk. We can see on the left-hand side of this screen, this no man's land. As an aerial view, a camera has taken this from the sky, so somebody flew over, and we can see this gap between the two sets of trenches. Now, trench warfare, as we said, there was a reason people dug trenches. If you look at these soldiers, what is the advantage for these soldiers, these German soldiers in the trench? Why is the trench advantageous to them? So you can see that they're reduced from the scenery, and therefore they're reduced from the level, and therefore they're able to hide and not be shot at. What's the negative for them if you think about them in this pit of mud? If you think about them, where this ground is not used to being 2 meters deep, this hole, what would happen within that ditch? Some of you may have noticed the water near where they are, and what might that water be doing as it seeps in? So they were excellent for defences. Soldiers were generally kept safe from enemy fire if they kept their heads down. So that's why generally people had to duck down just to make sure their heads didn't pop out, because if their heads popped out, it's something the snipers, those accurate shooters, could shoot at. However, they were extremely dangerous and difficult to attack for the enemy. So if we wanted to attack them, there was lots of soldiers waiting for us. So they're a very good defensive strategy. The Western Front became what's called a stalemate, so neither side could move, neither side could win for most of the war. So for 4 years, these trenches were there. It moved occasionally if one side did well in a battle, and then might move back. But for many years, so for 4 years, these soldiers were stuck on these trenches, whilst they might have moved forward and backwards. There were such good defensive techniques that it meant it was a very difficult way of people moving forward. One of the most famous battles that occurred on that Western Front occurred in 1916 in France. It was called the Battle of the Somme. It was a planned attack by the Allied forces on the German trenches, and it was supposed to be almost like a magic trick, whereby going there, people would not notice them going there. So to draw the Germans' attention away from weaker points and push them back, so that if the Germans were looking over there, the German soldiers would not then attack the place where there was a greater weakness. It was the largest attack on the Western Front during the war, and 1 million soldiers lost their lives. 1 million soldiers. In our school, there are 200 children. 5 times our school would be 1,000. 500 times our school would be 100,000. 5,000 times our school would be 1 million people. Sorry, 50,000. So the scale of this is horrendous. I'd like you to have a look at these photos and just have a think about what you think the life for these soldiers was like. They were living there for months on end. They were living in these conditions. If you see the soldier on the right, he's wearing a helmet to protect himself. What's happening with his feet? What's in that trench? If you see the soldiers on the left, what are their huts built out of on that trench? Where are they sleeping? It was dirty, smelly, and often meant living in constant fear of enemy attacks. So we can see the scale of the gun, the artillery gun that they were using. The sound constantly of gunfire is something that many of the poets, many of the people, the historians who wrote about and write about that time talk of. Soldiers suffered from what was called shell shock, where the intense bombings left them panicking and scared or unable to reason, sleep, walk, or talk. We know lots more about this now. We call this post-traumatic stress disorder. And it can last a long time, sometimes for people's whole lives. Back then, we didn't know much about it. As a society, we treated these people like they were weaker. However, in fact, they were just hurt by what had happened to them. If they'd hurt their leg, we would have helped them fix their leg. If they were hurt inside, we didn't help them as we should have. For these soldiers, then, these became their homes. Many soldiers had to experience sleep sitting against the side of their trenches in their uniforms. Their uniforms were dirty, wet, cold, very wet, rarely washing or shaving. This meant that lice became a huge problem in the soldiers, and it wasn't a good place to. Soldiers' clothing became covered in lice, itching over time, so they kept themselves awake even though they were so tired. They'd spend hours delousing, getting rid of the lice in their clothes. This was a waste of time, as the lice would burrow into the seams and lay eggs. Some cat soldiers would use a candle flame, running it along the seams to get rid of the lice. They'll be able to hear the lice and their eggs papping the flame that has passed over them. In the wet weather of northern France and Belgium, the trenches, no man's land, became basins for sticky mud and flooding. Moving heavy vehicles was almost impossible, and getting across no man's land to attack became more and more difficult. Many soldiers suffered from what was known as trench foot. This could cause the skin on the foot to lose feeling or become painful and rot. It happened when the soldiers' feet were left wet in the flooded trenches for too long. It was a horrible time for these people. these men, should I say, because it was just men at this point. The soldiers had to live amongst the huge populations of rats which scavenged food in the trenches. The rats would grow huge and steal the soldiers' food rations. Rations were the small amounts of food that people were given. And the verb to ration, so food was rationing to the soldiers, that's because there was not much food. They mainly ate stew and hard biscuits. The lack of vegetables meant they became poorly, because as we know from our work in other years, a balanced diet is crucial to our healthy body. There was something special which people talk of in 1914, near Christmas. Players played football in a game where they stopped fighting, and in that no man's land they played, exchanged foods, wished each other Merry Christmas, sang carols, and played football, and did not fight. But that was not repeated again. However, people still think of it as a special time for humanity now. After the war, where no man's land had been, lots of people had lied dead. Soldiers started to notice that poppies were growing. Fields of poppies grew over the areas. And now, people buy poppies at this time of year in November to remember soldiers. Have a think about why you think that might be. What is it? Now, initially, it was the wives and the families of soldiers who died who made poppies and sold them. But now the image reminds people of that great time, of that great battle, of the Battle of the Somme, and reminds people of the lives that were lost. In addition to the video that you're watching now, there's also a video which is on or a link to a BBC website. I'd like you to have a look at that if you're able to, and particularly focus on the videos, but also have a look, if you can, at the typical day in the life of the trenches, looking at what they do in their day, looking at how early they wake up, looking at what they do in the evening. Okay. And then this links to the work you're going to be asked to do. The first thing I'd like you to do is think about this diary table, or like a timetable. You're going to look at that look at the information from the website about the soldiers and identify what they do at what time. And then what I'd like you to do, as I've shown you just here, sorry guys, so you look at that over here, I'd like you to try and put in the time column, use military time, so the 24-hour time, so 0500. What were they being asked to do, the World War I soldier? What you would be doing if it were Christmas. So let's pretend it were Christmas, during the Christmas holidays. I know at the moment things are a little bit different. And then think about which one you prefer and why. I'm imagining most of the time you prefer your life at Christmas than if you had been a soldier in World War I, but just compare and contrast those two elements. Second task I'd like you to do is write a letter home from a soldier on the Western Front. Now, there's two tools to use for this. There's the information in the Life in the Trenches article, which is part of your pack. And there's also those photos. You've seen some of them in the slideshow already, and you'll see some in your pack. So I'd like you to maybe write a letter home where you just talk about what you're doing on a day-to-day level. The timetable you've done will sort of act as a plan. What would you be doing in the morning? How would you be feeling? What would you be spending your time worrying about? The final task is you're going to make a periscope. Now, you've got the instructions and you've got the template. As part of this, I'd also like you to have a think about why. Why would we make it a periscope? Why would a soldier need them? Okay, Year 6, I look forward to seeing all those bits of work. See you soon. Bye-bye.